When I first started, I was 13 years old. So, when would that be? It might have been about that time. Of course, I wasn't playing, you should pardon the expression, professionally at that time. But I was playing. I was probably taking lessons at the same time. But when I played my first professional job, if you want to call it, that is, I got paid for it when I was 13 years old. Now, the quality of my performance at that time was not very good, but apparently it wasn't that important to the people that I played for at the time, because the guys that I was working with were roughly about the same professional quality at the same level, so nobody knew the difference between my playing and their playing, I was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, my folks moved to Pontiac. My two older sisters and I were very young at the time. I was 9 months old when my folks moved to Pontiac. My father had a job waiting for him when he came to Pontiac, because at that time they were trying to recruit people to come to work in the north in the factories, because at that time there was a shortage of workers. So my father, I guess, found out through some means that there was work available. He had this job waiting for him when he got there. So he was very lucky. Sometimes I wish we had settled in Detroit instead of Pontiac, because there was more going on musically there, but Pontiac was only 25 miles north of Detroit, so it wasn't too bad. See, my father specialized in lumber. Now, at his job at the time at the Bodette Brothers factory, which is what it used to be called in the beginning, see, it started as Bodette Brothers, then it became Fisher Body, then it became Yellow Truck and Coach, then it became General Motors. So my father went through all those various stages of the company. But when he first started, it was called Bodette Brothers. And he worked as a lumber inspector there for all of his working career, except during the period when they converted from wood to metal in cars. See, at one time, a lot of wood was used in the construction of cars, especially trucks. But that was gradually phased out, and metal took over. So at that time, he was still there, but he became more like a foreman over the department, which then included metal as well as lumber. There was very little lumber work after a certain year. I'm not sure what the year was, but it was phased out fairly early on in the production of cars and trucks. My father was an amateur guitar player, and my mother was also an amateur pianist. And when I say amateur, she could play. She was a very good reader. She read church songs, hymnals. My father didn't play much, but he knew the guitar, and he could sit around and play a few things on the guitar, but never at a professional level. He didn't consider himself a professional. He wasn't that. But yes, he was musical. Not as musical as my mother. My mother also sang. All of my sisters sang as well. My mother used to make sure that we heard a lot of music, because she would always bring in recordings of the pop singers, of the big jazz bands of the day, the Duke Ellington bands, the Louis Armstrong orchestras at that time, and later on the Jimmy Lunceford orchestras, and of course the Benny Goodman orchestras later on. But there was always music in the house, and there were a lot of blues records, that I don't even remember the names of. But we heard a lot of music. We heard a great variety of music at that time. Jazz, mostly jazz and blues, but there was an awful lot of it at that time. That played, I think, a big part in the musical direction that I eventually went in, I suppose. You tend to remember the things that you hear the most of. And we heard an awful lot of blues at that time. And I failed to mention Duke Ellington, of course. Duke Ellington was on, Earl Hines. These were all the bands we listened to. Jimmy Lunceford, I mentioned him. There were some other bands too, but these were the principal bands, most popular ones. I had an older sister named Olive, who was a very fine pianist. And she was, at the age of 12, when she was 12 years old, she was doing concerts, and she was considered a sort of prodigy because she was musically beyond her years. She had advanced musically far beyond her years. She unfortunately lost her life in an ice skating accident on a lake that wasn't too far from where we used to live in Pontiac. A very, very unfortunate thing. It broke my mother's heart. But then I had another sister younger than she was who also played piano. And I was the third, of course, in line. When we took lessons, we'd all take lessons on the same day. My sister Olive would take lessons, and Melinda would take lessons, then it was my turn, you know. So I had a chance to listen to all the things that the teacher was telling them. So when it got to me, I knew what she was going to say before she said it, you know. Well, there was Thaddeus, you heard it, we call him Thad, and there was Anna Mae, and then there was Paul, and then there was Edith, and then there was Tom, and then there was Elvin. Now, Elvin's twin, see, Elvin's name was Elvin Ray, and his twin's name was Alvin Roy, but unfortunately he passed as an infant. Paul was the other one who played piano. You probably had never heard of Paul. Paul didn't become a musician, but he could play the piano. He studied piano, and he would have been a good musician had he chosen to make that his career. He would have been a very fine pianist. Tom was musically inclined, but for one reason or another, he didn't follow it. He had a fantastic memory. He could listen to records and tell you, out of the hundreds of records that we had, he could tell you who the soloist was on each record, and he could even hum the solo that he played. So he was musically inclined, but he never followed it. Dad, of course, you know what, Dad was a great arranger and also a great composer, and had a great band, and a great player, which a lot of people don't know about, because when Thad and Mel had their big band, Thad used to let the trumpet players in the band play the solos. So you didn't recognize or didn't realize that Thad himself was a great trumpet player. But he never got a chance to be heard because he let the other fellows play instead of him. But he had a great band. He and Mel had a great orchestra. My sister Melinda also could have been a fine pianist, but she didn't choose to make that her main profession. Then I guess that was it. The others, of course, you know about Elvin. Elvin was a fantastic guy. So I wonder what would have happened if his twin had lived. I wonder if his twin would have also been a drummer. But that's something we'll never know. When I first left Pontiac, actually I didn't go very far away. I went to Flint, Michigan. I went to Detroit prior to that, which was only 25 miles away. But then the next time, I went to Flint, which was 45 miles from Pontiac. And I worked with a small group there, Jimmy Parker, whom I had known in Pontiac when he was only 15. He was only 2 years older than I was. He was 15, I was 13, we're in the same band. But he was a good arranger, and he played all the instruments in the band. He played trumpet, saxophone, trombone, you name it, bass horn, piano, tuba, played everything. And was a good arranger besides. Jimmy Parker, if he had chosen to stay in the music business, he would have, everybody would have known about it. His name would have been as great as Charlie Parker or any of the greats, Lester Young, Coleman, but he chose not to. He became a plumbing salesman or something like that. You know? But and then he had a large family. I think he had about 15 kids, you know, something like that. So I'm sure that took up all the time he had for recreation. But anyway, he would have been very, very well known had he chosen to stay in the business. But I'm sure that if I met him, if I saw him today and heard him, I could still hear that wonderful talent that he had. He played beautiful trumpet, played beautiful tenor. I can't imagine why he wouldn't have stayed in the business, but he had his own reasons. Then I went to Saginaw, Michigan, and that's where I met Sonny Stitt. Sonny Stitt's father, I believe, had lived in Saginaw, Michigan for a while. He was later on a professor of music, I think, in one of the colleges in Brooklyn. But I met Sonny in Saginaw. Also met Dorothy Donegan there, by the way. So, and then Saginaw, I spent some time in Lansing working with a small band. Benny Carew was the leader, a drummer and singer. And in that band, we had people like Wardell Gray, Art House, the trumpet player, Lucky Thompson. I'm sure you've heard of these people. But it was a good band. And then later on, I moved to Cleveland, Ohio. And I worked with a small band there for maybe about 6 or 7 months. And then from Cleveland, I went to Buffalo, New York. I worked in Buffalo for about a year with a trio which consisted of a bass player, tenor saxophone player, and piano, rather an unusual trio. But then from Buffalo, I came to New York City. This was about late 44, early 45. And I've been in New York, around like so since then. Well, yes, Artie had a band. You might have heard of the Gramercy Five. Okay, well, he had a small band called the New Gramercy Five. This was maybe 7 or 8 years after the first one. The one I was in had Tal Farlow guitar, Joe Rowland on vibes, Tommy Potter at bass, Irv Kluger drums, some fellow named Artie Shaw playing clarinet, and I was the pianist. And we opened at the Embers in 1953 in New York. And then we worked there for several weeks, and then after that, we did a few jobs out of town, but the band didn't really last that long. Economic conditions were not conducive to having a band at that time, but it was a great experience. And then later on, I worked with Benny Goodman Orchestra, with the sextet, the trio, quartet, and the big band. We did several tours. I did a Far Eastern tour with Benny in 1956 for the State Department. And it was very interesting. We got back, and I also played the Waldorf Astoria Hotel with Benny, and a few other places. But Benny didn't stay on the road that much. He did a few selected places. He played for dances in a few places, but the band didn't really stay on the road that long. He'd do a few college dates here and there, but didn't stay on the road for any extensive periods of time. Well, you mentioned one, Teddy Wilson, certainly, and of course Art Tatum, of course. But I never heard Art Tatum in a big band context. He had a trio at one time, Slam Stewart and I forget the guitar player's name. But people like that, even Earl Hines. A lot of people think that Earl Hines may have had the style that may have been the forerunner of the Be-Bop style, because it was a single line style. He played a lot of stuff with his right hand, a lot of lines and figures and so forth, that may have inspired some of the early Be-Bop artists. But I mean, people like that inspired me. Teddy Wilson certainly was one. Fats Waller was another one. Of course, Duke Ellington. Although I didn't think of Duke Ellington as a pianist as much as an arranger and a band leader. His pianistic style wasn't as impressive, I guess because he didn't play that much. He was always conducting the band and, of course, arranging for the band. But people like that inspired me, and I guess I don't know. I'd have to say that I can't say that I patterned myself after anyone in particular, except that I always liked the two-handed piano style. That is where you use both hands. Especially when it came to the thing of playing solo. When you're playing solo piano, you're almost compelled to use two hands, because I haven't heard a one-handed pianist yet be a soloist. But yes, that's very important. Some of the younger players, though, who came along much later, I think became one-handed pianists because they depended on the bass player for the bass notes in the left hand. Well, if you're playing solo, you can't let that happen, because it's impossible to play without using both hands. But since they only played in groups that employed a bass player, then they could rely on the bass player for the bass, and all they had to do was concentrate on the right hand, because the drummer was taking care of the rhythm as well. So I think that's why that happened. But anyway, to me, you can enjoy music from a pianist who is playing solo much more fully, if he's using both hands to the best advantage. I think the main thing I got from these people that I mentioned was the fact that they were not only great soloists, but they had also great musical ideas, and their execution was perfect. Teddy Wilson, while his style was not as fluent as Art Tatum's, That is, he didn't play such a large volume of notes. He had a very distinctive rhythmic style that I thought was fantastic. And I think that although he didn't play very much solo, he played with the Benny Goodman trio. And I think that he contributed a lot to that trio and probably had a lot to do with the success of that group. And I think Benny loved him, of course, his musical playing. Fats Waller was more of a soloist who used a very rhythmical left hand and always played the correct harmonic sequences. I think that's what I got from these people more than anything else, and especially Art Tatum. His playing exemplified the best of every category of jazz piano that you'd like to mention. He had the stamina, he had the execution, he had the ideas, he had the facility, and he had the musical mind. So you get something from each of these people. I don't think what you get from each one is different, a little bit different than what you get from the other one, but put together, they form a model of playing that you try to emulate. Now, you don't try to emulate any one style particularly. What you do is you combine all the best qualities of all of these people, you try to emulate that. And that takes you in a different direction, because at the same time, you're putting more of yourself into the music or into the ideas, musical ideas that you're playing. So it's a process. It's an evolutionary kind of thing. You don't do it overnight. It happens over time. For instance, I was discussing something with somebody. They asked me, "What about? Could I compare my playing, let's say, 25 years ago, to what I'm playing today?" Well, there's a big difference, except that I don't know when the difference took place. I don't know when the change took place, because it evolved over time. And I think that's what happens with your musical ideas. They evolve over time. What you do is you learn to retain the things that you like about whatever you hear, and you edit out the things you don't like. So the things that you include in your playing are the ideas that you can hear, let's say, in any example of the current where you're playing. And I think this is the way it works. It just happens over time. Your mind does that for you, because you automatically reject the things that you don't like, and you automatically use the things that you do like. You incorporate those things into your general style without playing note for note, which I think is a bad idea. What you do, you emulate the style, but not the exact notes. You don't want to play just like anybody else, because then you're not expressing your own self. You want your own identity to come through. Well, I think one of the main things, and maybe others as well, it's hard to pinpoint any one thing, but what I try to do basically is if I do something, let's say if I play this way at this particular time, the next time I play, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to improve on that. In other words, you have to start from A. When you go to B, you want to improve on what you did in A. And if you go on to C and D and so forth, you try to improve on every performance or at every stage. So I think this happens. What happens over time is that you're always influenced by outside things that you hear, perhaps, or outside things that your mind tries to project. Because many of the things that you play, you haven't heard before, but your mind is constantly seeking other avenues. What you're trying to do, and the main thing, I think the point is that you're always trying to improve on your last performance. And I think that's what keeps it fresh. Or it should, let's put it that way. That's what should keep it fresh. But if you don't constantly or consciously try to do that, I don't think it happens. It doesn't happen by accident. It's a conscious effort on the part of the player to do that. And I think that's what accounts for the sound. Hopefully the sound that continues to improve and make sounds more contemporary as time goes on. Contemporary in the sense that it evolves, because nothing stands still. Everything evolves, maybe slowly or faster, slow or fast, but it evolves. And that's what you try to do. You try to keep pace with the changing style or the changing perception of what is happening, and you try to match that with your own skills. And so it's a meld. It's an amalgam of many different things, ideas, Your technique, of course, should always be at a certain level. Otherwise, you can't interpret what you're thinking, what you can conceive. You have to have the technique to perform what you can conceive in your mind, because one without the other doesn't mean anything. If you don't, if you don't have, if you have the conception without the means to project it, it's meaningless. So everything has to move at the same pace. And I think that's basically what happens. Practice. That old bugaboo, you must practice. Now, the amount of time that you practice depends on many things. How much time do you have to practice? What is the motive for your practice? Are you trying to learn new material, or just trying to keep pace? In any case, you must practice. And the more time you can put in on it, especially on the areas, let's say, that you're the weakest in, whatever. I'm sure that any performer knows the areas that he's the most weak, so he can concentrate on those areas. You try to improve those areas. And that's what practice is all about. You maintain a certain level of performance skill. You've heard that old, it's an old saying. I think Paderewski is supposed to have said, if I miss practice 1 week, I know it. If I miss practice 2 weeks, my wife knows it. If I miss practice for 3 weeks, everybody knows it. So I think that's basically true. It may be exaggerated here or there, but basically true. No matter who you work with, if it's a big band, you conform to, you tailor your playing to that particular style of playing. If it's Benny Goodman, you tailor your performance to what is expected of you in a small group setting. In other words, with the Benny Goodman trio, you were, since most of the time you didn't use the bass because there'd just be piano, bass, and clarinet. So the pianist then had to take care of the harmonic projections, the harmonic structure, because that's the only thing that was happening musically, because the drummer couldn't do it. His preoccupation was keeping time. Certainly the soloists couldn't do it because you can only play one note at a time. So it falls to the pianist then to fill in all the spots that would be left vacant, providing rhythmic support, harmonic support, and support for the soloist, staying out of the way, being an accompanist in addition to being all these other things, because that's what playing for a soloist is all about. You're a company. You cannot solo at the same time the soloist is soloing, because if you do, you have what is described as a train wreck. They're not pleasant, but anyway, that's musical train wreck, so to speak. But basically that's what happens. So when you're playing with any group, whether it's the John Kirby group or whether it's or Benny Goodman or Artie Shaw or any of the big bands or any group, Coleman Hawkins, small band, Lester Young, wherever, no matter, you tailor your playing, you adjust your playing to whatever style the soloist requires or whatever the unit requires, the section requires. And you try to do the thing that's going to provide the most support for the soloist and the group as well. I never go into a group saying, well, okay, now this is my chance to be a big star. I'm going to overshadow everybody else. No, that's the wrong way to think. And I'm afraid sometimes pianists get that point. They follow that point of view. That's not a good way to think. What you do is when you join a group, you try to enhance what is happening. You try to enhance the soloist. You try to enhance the musical background so that it becomes more of a unit. And it's a lot easier for the soloist then to perform. A lot of it depends on how well you listen. And if you do a good job of listening, then an adaptation, you can then fit in with any group. And that's what it's all about, adapting. I don't see how you can work with anybody without conforming to the style of playing of the group that you're working with or going in to work with. Otherwise, you don't want to change the character of the group, which is assuming it's already there. You certainly don't want to change it. What you try to do is enhance it. So in order to do that, you have to listen, play only the things that will enhance, not detract. It's a very simple process, really. You can set the tone for the rhythm section by setting an example of what to do and what not to do. Because sometimes, let's say, drummers might get a little bit too enthusiastic, too exuberant, and expressive, so to speak. So what you do is you try to have a calming influence. In other words, you try to let things go along smoothly, and realizing at all times that you're there to support the solos. When it comes time for the various instruments to solo, all that changes. When it's time for the pianist to solo, then you play in the solo mode, you see. Otherwise, you play in the accompaniment mode. To me, it's a very simple thing, and I think that it's something that you have to constantly be aware of, because if you don't, you'll fall victim to that other way of playing, without regard to whatever. So you listen first. You find out what's needed, and then you do that, to try to enhance the overall performance of the group, of the soloists and the group. But I try to influence the play of the drummer and the bass player by my own playing. I try to set the tone for it. I use a comping style that is compatible with what the soloist wants and what the rhythm section I think should sound like. But what I try to do is I try to get everybody to listen, because unless you listen to what's going on around you, how can you adapt? You can't adapt to anything. So you have to be aware of what's taking place around you, what the soloist is doing, what the drummer is doing, what the bass player is doing. And so, in a sense, you set the tone. I think the key to a successful small group is what the pianist is doing, the pianist's direction, because that sets the level of performance, or sets the performance, the performance level of the group as a whole, of the rhythm section as a whole. We were talking about the rhythm section here. Now, all of this is done to enhance the performance of the soloist, whomever the soloist may be. It could be a vocalist, because it could be it's even more critical when the soloist is a vocalist, whether it's male or female, because now it's more critical not to get in the way musically of what the soloist is doing, trying to perform. With the horn, there's a little more leeway, but you still have the same principles to follow, it seems to me. I don't want to be dogmatic about this, but I think that's the way. I think that's the way it should go. Everyone considered the drums not as an adjunct to the orchestra, but also as a solo instrument. He thought of the drums as something that could project its own image, and do that in such a way that it didn't destroy the image of the band. Because it meant playing within certain parameters and yet getting out of the box long enough to express his own personal viewpoint, musically speaking and rhythmically speaking. He could tell a story with his drums that could not be told with any other instrument. And of course, in doing so, it added to the influence of the group. It enhanced the group. And I use that word enhanced all the time, because I think what you're doing is trying to improve what's there. And if it isn't there, you try to establish something that can be carried on. I think what Elvin did was essentially the same thing that, let's say, any accompanist does. He tried to suit the style of drums to the style of the soloist or the band. So if somebody's playing a solo, he would take maybe a hi-hat. Well, the hi-hat is always going, but he would try to use the top cymbal or the top whatever, the tom-tom or the snare, whatever. He tried to use all of the elements of the drum in order to improve that performance, add to it, make it more exciting, more listenable, without getting in the way, without overbalancing. You see, it's a critical area. You have to be very specific about how you do it, because if you do too much of any one thing, it destroys what you're trying to improve. So you have to stay within certain parameters. And he did that very well. I think that's what most drummers, I think that's what they unconsciously are trying to do, even though some of them perhaps don't do it in the same way Elvin did. It's almost the same thing that the pianist has to do, I think he did that very well. Maybe he did it so well that people didn't realize he was doing it, because he did it not in an overbearing way that just overshadowed everything else, but blended with everything else in such a way that it became part of the whole. Artie, well, first of all, let's say they were both excellent technicians. They both knew the instrument thoroughly. They could play anything. Then it becomes a question of taste, style. Now, I heard a transcription of Artie and Benny playing in the same orchestra, an NBC orchestra, at the same time. They were both playing, and they both played solos on this one transcription. At the time, there was a difference in their playing, but basically the tone was the same. Now, later on, after that, they began to diverge tonally. Benny's tone became, let's say, more, let's say, a sharper tone. Artie's remained at maybe a different level. They were both great performers. Benny's approach seemed to be, let's say, more responsive to the mood of the piece. Artie's approach was more responsive to the harmonic changes that took place within a tune. Artie would play all of the changes that were there. Benny's approach was maybe not so much harmonically, but overriding. He could swing over everything. He played lines that could adapt. You know, it mattered what the harmony was, but his lines always conformed to the harmony. With Artie was very particular about the harmony that he used, the harmonic structure of the chords, you know, the progressions. So to me, that's the main difference. They both had wonderful tones, or have wonderful tones, you know, or had, in Benny's case. And I talked to Artie, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. He's not playing anymore, but I'm sure that if he was playing, he'd sound the same way today. Benny's personality was, let's say, well, first of all, I have to say he was a perfectionist, right? Benny. You've heard many stories about him, and there are many other stories. But musically, he was a perfectionist, and everything he did musically was absolutely desirable, you know. And the other thing you have to say about him or anybody else is that nobody is perfect. Many people have personality defects. I have them. Everybody has them, you know, I'm sure. But when it came to musical interpretation, he was without question, you know, at the top of the profession. Artie was the same way. He was a musical perfectionist. He was a perfectionist. We'd go on a recording date, when we worked at the Embers, we'd go from the Embers to a recording studio and record some of the tunes that Artie had written. And Artie was such a perfectionist that on some tunes, we would make 15 starts, not complete takes, but we would do it until it was absolutely correct, the way Artie wanted it. Perfectionist, you know. And he didn't consider it something that would be abhorrent to people. He considered it something that you would want to do because the end product would be something that you'd like to be proud of instead of something that you regret later on. You know? So, personality-wise, I don't want to. It's hard to get into that, but I can't. I'm not the best judge of that. You know, I'm not a psychiatrist. You know, I can't. But I would say that Artie was easy to work with. Benny was easy to work with, and as I said, they were both perfectionists. So if there were any differences, there were musical differences, because they both wanted everything to be as good as it possibly could be. So there's really nothing wrong with that, you know. I think anybody should be that way. You know? So their ways of getting to that point may have been different, but the point is that they always got there. Well, you know, I wasn't so much aware of the actual. Of course, I realized that it was everybody talked about the swing era. You realized that you were in it, and you mentioned several examples of bands. You know, the Benny Goodman band, the Dorsey band, maybe less so, but the Glenn Miller band, perhaps a little different category, and they all featured the popular, as you said, the popular instruments. You know, Tommy Dorsey was famous, and his brother Jimmy Dorsey was very well known as a saxophonist. Benny Goodman, of course, as a clarinet, and Artie Shaw, of course, with his big band, also a clarinet. I guess it was just the area where people, for instance, I think it coincided with the fact that during that period, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of dance halls across the country. Uh, that was the area whenever, the era rather, when people liked to dance. Part of it was during the war that was going on at the time. Um, but eventually, the dance halls faded out, and I think that coincided with the fact that the big band era sort of faded out at the same time, because the big band era coexisted with the dancing craze, you might call it, as exemplified by all the dance halls around. When the dance halls became supermarkets, the big bands became small bands. They splintered, became 3, 5-piece, 6-piece trios, duos, sort of thing. So I think the split up or the downfall of that era coincided with the disappearance of the dance halls. That's a tie-in that a lot of people don't make, but to me it seems very obvious, because where was the big band going to play if it wasn't for dances? If there were no dance halls, where could they play? Maybe concerts, but concerts were not that popular during that period. That's the way I would look at it. I think that it's unfortunate. On the other hand, maybe the era of the big bands had reached its zenith, and maybe it was time for it to go into decline. Maybe it's in a cycle. Maybe that was the peak of the cycle. Maybe that cycle will repeat again. Who knows? There seems to be more interest in big bands today than there was, let's say, 5 years ago. So maybe that's a good thing. So I think it will repeat eventually. I came to New York in the late 40s, maybe 46, 45, around in there, 44, late 44, 45. The Be-Bop era was still in full force, but had started to decline a little bit, because you had a place called Swing Street, which 52nd Street. It was about a block and a half of a street that was lined on both sides with jazz clubs. The Onyx Club, the Three Deuces, the Spotlight, Jimmy Ryan's, which was a Dixieland place, the Famous Door, so forth. This was the area where the Be-Bop era was sort of declining, you know. Eventually, 52nd Street didn't exist anymore because it's now completely gone. But this kind of music was being played. It was quite popular, at least among musicians during that time. Be-Bop never really caught on with the general public until after it was gone, you might say. You know, people say, "Oh yeah, that was the Be-Bop era." Well, at the time, the Be-Bop players were having a tough time making a living, you know. But that's the way things seem to happen in the business. Actually, the Be-Bop has existed. It still exists in many forms today that are recognized as, let's say, as standard music, because a lot of the arrangements that are written by the best arrangers today incorporate Be-Bop. And perhaps people don't even realize that they're hearing it, but they're hearing a different version of it, you know. Because in the days when it when it existed, let's say, on 52nd Street and other places, it was done by musicians like the well-known musicians like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell, people like that, but not done on a big band scale, except in the one instance, maybe two instances where you heard the Dizzy Gillespie big band or the Billy Eckstine big band. But those were the only two big bands that really were playing bebop, and they didn't really last that long, you know. So, I guess it had a short run, I suppose, as musical styles go, but then, in a sense, it has had it still exists. So maybe the run is longer than people realize, but it exists in a form that people don't recognize as bebop today. You know, it's there, but it isn't there. You know. Bebop, I don't like the term, first of all, at the outset. I think that somewhere in the vernacular there has to be a better term for that music than bebop. But I think I like to think of it as music that was contemporary to the times. Now, how you break that down or how you shorten that into a slogan, I don't know. But bebop, to me, when you hear the term bebop, to the average person, it's almost like a derogatory. When they at that time it was a derogatory term, essentially, because most people didn't embrace that kind of music. Even some musicians that I met during the period didn't like it because they thought it was too involved or something. They had various reasons, but I think, as I said, I'd like to hear it expressed as a music that was contemporary to the time. Of course, that's almost like it's almost like saying the same thing, but it was contemporary. It was the music of the time, of that particular period, in that particular era, and particular spot. It wasn't popular in the Midwest, and it had a hard time in California, but in the East and Mid-East, it was popular. Let's say from Detroit further east. But I think it's a very strange thing. I guess when historians write of it, let's say 100 years from today, they'll think it was very strange that the whole country didn't embrace it at the same time, but that didn't happen. It happened primarily in the East, and maybe a few places in the West, but very few. Los Angeles was not one of them, I understand. But anyway, that's sort of a spotty history of the term of bebop. I wish we could come up with another name for it. I think in some respects, one of the things I think that may have, in a sense, turned people off, to use a world-worn phrase and perhaps overused, is the fact that sometimes it may have, the perception might have been to the general public or the general average listener who is not familiar with music particularly, that a lot, and even in some cases where you were familiar with music, it might have seemed that certain individuals or certain players, exponents, might have used a lot of complexity unnecessarily because it didn't actually relate to telling the story of the music. In other words, it was complexity or difficult, different passages for the sake of. In other words, they believe, some people believe that in trying to tell a story with 10,000 notes is better than trying to tell the story with maybe a couple of hundred notes. In other words, instead of doing it simply, they did it in a complex manner, which showed off perhaps their versatility on the instrument, perhaps, but didn't do much musically to support the idea that they were trying to convey. And this was a problem, I think, for the listener. And it was also a problem for a lot of musicians who would like to have embraced it more fully, but said, well, is all this really necessary, in order to tell a musical story? One good example, I suppose, although you couldn't count this band as a band that was popular during the bebop era, maybe at the tail end of it, but I think of the Count Basie band, and I think of Count Basie's method of playing the piano, which was, let's say, you might say he used a style that was very frugal, let's say, as far as notes were concerned, but it told the story efficiently. Now, whether you like this style or not, you have to admit that it was a lot easier to listen to Basie play a solo than maybe somebody was playing 10,000 notes that didn't mean anything. Basie played on the essential notes. And I'm not saying that that's the style that everybody should play. I'm saying that it may have been the style that the general public could understand better, as proven by the popularity of the Basie band. It was much more popular than some other bands where other styles of music were being played. You could understand the Basie music. I wouldn't advocate that for a solo pianist because it's a little too sparse, because you're not telling the full harmonic story of what you're playing. But it is a way of conveying music to the public. This is not to say that the public is incapable of understanding more complex things, but it's a way to get the music across in a way that it's generally accepted. But that's just my viewpoint. As I said, I don't want to sound dogmatic about this. But when I came to New York in 1945, maybe late 44, 45, as I said, I had a job waiting for me in a sense because I had heard about Lucky Thompson, who had been with the Hot Lips Page Orchestra, said that Lips Page needed a pianist. So when I got to New York, I went right to work. After that little short 30-day waiting period, 6-month waiting period, you can't. When I came to New York, you couldn't work on a steady job until you had deposited your transfer in the local union, and you had to sort of wait and do just one-nighters or whatever, short gigs, until the period where you could do full-time work. So after that period had arrived, I went to work at the Onyx Club with Lips, and I worked there with a small band for maybe 6 or 7 months. After which time we went on the road with this big band. We did a 3-month tour of the South. We went to all like places like all the southern states. Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, so forth. And we did 3 months of those one-nighters. It's pretty tough, really. One-nighters are tough, but especially when you're not really traveling first class. But that happened that was a good experience. After that time, I came back to New York, and I think the next thing I did was a short stint with the John Kirby small band. At the time, it was billed as the biggest little band in the world. You might have heard that every time. And they were good. They had people like Charlie Shavers, because Charlie Shavers, Buster Bailey, Bill Beeson, drums, and of course John Kirby was the bass player, who had been a bass player with the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra prior to that. But it was a good little band. Charlie Shavers did a lot of the arranging, and of course he was a great trumpet player. After that, I did some things with the Andy Kirk Big Band. That was a great experience. We did theaters, mostly theater dates. Apollo Theater, a 3-day theater up in Hartford, Washington, D.C. I forget the name of that theater. Baltimore, places like that. Mostly theater jobs. I did 1 or 2 dances with that big band. Andy Kirk, perfect gentleman. He was one of the few gentlemen. I hate to say that, but he was. He was really. I'm glad to be able to say it about Andy Kirk. I'm sorry that I can't say it about some other leaders, but Andy was a very likable person. I don't know of anybody that didn't like Andy Kirk. It wasn't that he was that easygoing, but he held himself on such a level that he commanded respect. He didn't demand it; he commanded respect, and you always had respect for him. Always had a good band. At one time, Mary Lou Williams, the fine lady who played piano, worked with his band and was one of the arrangers. Did some great arranging for the band. But that was, of course, much earlier than when I went with the band. I enjoyed working with that band. It wasn't a very long time. I'd say I don't think it lasted more than 3 or 4 months altogether. But it was a great experience. And then after that, I began working with Benny Goodman. Actually, I worked with Artie Shaw with a small group before the Benny Goodman band. And then the Benny Goodman big band and the trio and the quartet and sextet, all that. Benny did a lot of college dates, a few dances, and not any recording that I know of, although I understand some of the concerts were recorded. I found that out later. However, it was a great experience. I don't think I missed.
How long were you with Benny Goodman?
Benny, overall, for a number of years, because I didn't stay with the band for any long periods at any one time. But I would always get calls from his office to come and do something with the band, over a period of maybe 10, 12 years, or maybe even longer than that, But at various times. And the first engagement we did, one of the first ones was at the Waldorf Astoria, the big band. And, when you worked with the big band, there were always times when you worked with a sextet or the trio or the quartet out of the band, He'd come out on the floor and he'd do the small group things. And that happened most of the time, except at dances. Usually at the dances, they were all big band stuff, And some of the college dates, we did a number of concerts in Connecticut, nearby places. We'd go out to Ohio. Sometimes we worked in Alaska. Sometimes we worked on the West Coast. Sometimes, I did some jazz at the Philharmonic things, but I think this was after the Benny Goodman thing. I did a few, maybe 3 or 4 years of tours with JTP. But at the time when I first started, Norman Granz used to do 2 tours a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. So we did 2 tours a year. That was interesting, you know, but you know, the people that were involved with that, Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, Buddy Rich, or sometimes Joe Jones, Ray Brown, Bill Harris, Lester Young, Charlie Shavers, Roy Eldridge, people like that. Helen Humes at one time, and Ella Fitzgerald, of course, at one time. But this went on for about 4 years, after little 4 years. In between those periods, I used to stay in New York and freelance recording. I did a lot, that's where a lot of the recording took place. And then during that period, shortly after that period, I got a job at CBS, which came about because I had done some recording with Andy Williams. In fact, I did Andy Williams, the last show that he had in a summer series at NBC. I did his last show, and when he went to ABC the following year to do a summer replacement show, replacing the Pat Boone show, he called me to do that show. So I did that summer series. The next year, he did a full-time show at CBS, and so he called me to do that show. That's how I got the job at CBS. And I stayed with CBS for about 17 years after that. But at the same time, I think there was a correlation there between the fact that a lot of variety shows were originating in New York, and at the same time, nightclubs proliferated in New York. They seemed to go hand in hand. People would come in to do nightclub performance, and they would be a guest on some variety show during that same period. So one worked with the other. They both worked together. When the TV shows sort of faded out in New York, so did the nightclubs. So you had that same correlation, like we were talking about the dance halls and the big bands. You know, the big bands, they both sort of went down the drain at the same time. The nightclub business and TV shows sort of folded at the same time. I don't know which one started the downfall, but it certainly happened that way. But when I first started, yeah, there were many, not that many, but certainly there were big shows like the Carol Burnett show which came on later, but the Gary Moore show, 1 and 2, the Jackie Gleason show, 1 and 2, you know, because they did a second series after the first series. I didn't do the first series of either one of those shows, but I did the second series of the Gary Moore shows and the second series of the Jackie Gleason shows before he went to Florida. But that was a busy period, during which time I also did a lot of freelance recording after the shows or during the week. So I was doing both things. And then that's when the long tours started, not the long tours, but the overseas tours started. Because prior to that time, you could not leave New York because you're pretty well occupied doing those shows. So you had to stay in town. I started to do tours to Japan and tours to Europe, alternating, sometimes do 1 or 2 tours to Japan, 1 or 2 tours to Europe every year. And that has continued more or less up to this time, although I don't do as much work overseas as I did before. Right now I do more nightclubs in New York and around the country than I did before. When I started with Ella Fitzgerald as an accompanist, it was in the early part of 1948, as I recall. Maybe the latter part of 1947, because although she wasn't on the first tour that I did with JATP, which was in 1947, she was on each tour after that until I left the group. So it had to be either late 1947 or 1948, because in 1948 I also did a tour to England with her. We went to England, we played London, of course, and Scotland, and so forth. But then I stayed with Ella for about 4.5 years, which is a long time, but of course she had another pianist who stayed with her for 15 years, so in retrospect it's not that long. But it was all very enjoyable. And after Ella, that's when I really started to do freelancing in earnest, when I came back to New York. And by that time I'd also left JATP, which was about 1951 or thereabouts, you know. And I began to do a lot of freelancing. And then that's when my experiences with Artie Shaw and Benny Goodman took place, after that period, you know, during that time. after the Ella Fitzgerald JTP experience. And also the small band experience with John Kirby. And I think I mentioned Andy Kirk early on, but that's when the big band stuff started to happen. Well, Bing Crosby once described Ella as the greatest singer, man or woman, in the country. I was saying a lot because, Benny wasn't a bad singer himself. He might have said he was the greatest singer, but I think that was quite a compliment that he paid Ella. And she was a very versatile singer. She could do ballads as well as anybody. She could do scat as well as anybody could. She did a great variety of tunes, and was very popular for many years. And everybody loved her. I think everybody associated her with that first thing that sort of got her on the map was Tisket to Tasket. I think she was one of the writers. And she did that shortly after she worked with Chick Webb's band. She won the popularity contest, or the contest at the Apollo Theater. And immediately after that, she worked with the Chick Webb band. And she made the recording, I think, of Tisket to Tasket during that period. So that carried her a long way. In fact, she did that tune throughout her career. I can't tell you how many times I played that tune with her, but I mean, it was always popular. The audiences asked for it, So, what the old saying, you dance with who brung you, Well, that's what got her there, and she continued. The same thing could be said about Benny. Benny did with Goody. He played Goody from the first day I worked with him till the last day I worked with him. Covered a period of years. So that was her vehicle for getting into the swing of things. As far as being a person to work with, and I use the word "with," expressly, because you work for her, but you worked with her. It wasn't like you were a separate person outside her. You worked along with her. Everything was done, the arrangements. You were an integral part of the show, or the presentation, as it should be. Because as an accompanist, you have to learn what the style of the singer. You learn how the singer phrases, and you learn to play the proper accompaniment to the singer, supporting but not interfering. I guess those are the two best words you can say about an accompanist: support but don't interfere. But that's what you learn to do. And essentially, accompanying a singer is somewhat like accompanying a soloist, a horn soloist, for instance, or any other thing. Accompanying basically is the same, no matter regardless of whether it's a singer or whether it's an instrument, And that's where I like to look at it. But there are various degrees of expression or interpretation or styles of accompanying. Ella preferred a blocked chord style approach, perhaps dating from her days with Chick Webb. If you played a blocked chord style of accompaniment, I think it supported her best because she was used to that sound, sort of an orchestral sound in a sense, but of course not really, but I mean, in effect. You play the blocked chords to simulate the sound of the orchestra. And I think that helped her in her interpretation. Very, very, very easygoing person to work with, very, very pleasant, Really, I enjoyed every minute that I spent with her. She always had this wonderful exuberance, like it was happening for the first time, She brought that to every performance, every song, It was always like that. And I think that's what kept her alive in the eyes of the public as well. It certainly made her performances come to life, You never heard the same thing twice because the next one was always better than the last one. It was really great. Great experience working with her. Charlie was, of course, let's start with saying Charlie was a genius. It was a great experience, and it was always an educational experience for me to play with Charlie Parker. And let's say that I always learned something. And one of the things I regret now is that when he offered me a job working with him, I declined because I didn't think I was up to his standard of playing. But it was a great learning experience for me. I enjoyed it to the utmost. And that's it. It was very easygoing. I can say that, I don't think I ever heard Charlie Parker raise his voice once in all the years that I've ever known him, Always very quiet, level voice. but with a fantastic mind. His mind must have been going like a mile a minute. But at the same time, it must have been a quiet mind, because how can you play that way without having a well-ordered, disciplined mind? So I have to say that. But he was a fantastic musician, just unbelievable. I heard a lot of chord changes, progressions, and things that I had not previously heard before. I could hear his energy. I could feel. You could almost feel the direction he was going harmonically by what he played the bar or two before that. There's a certain continuity that takes place when you hear a great solo. You almost know what's going to happen next, so you don't anticipate it, but you're all ready to step into it when you get there. That's the one thing about him, because the great players like Charlie always had a great system of continuity to their playing. They didn't jump around from here to there. It was very orderly, very orderly, and it progressed harmonically, logically. That's what I think. That's one of the things I learned about his playing. And you get that same thing from most of the great players. I think I did a little stint. I know I did one recording with Dizzy Gillespie, the big band, but I never worked with Dizzy in a small band context, unless it was one of the times where he was with JATP. But I don't recall. I think he did one short tour with JATP, I believe. But Charlie Parker did the European tour with JATP that I was on. And the funny thing of it is, we were talking about Be-Bop, and Charlie, of course, was one of the greatest exponents of that style, the term which I don't like, but he was one of the greatest exponents, maybe the greatest. But I noticed that the receptions that he got from the audiences were not the same as some of the receptions that some of the other people got, like Bill Harris or Flip Phillips or Coleman Hawkins or Les Young. Charlie's receptions were very sparse, which tells me that a lot of people didn't understand what he was doing. Of course, that's the only explanation, because everything he did was executed perfectly. He was playing very logically, but people didn't understand it. And I suppose they were told that it was Be-Bop, and maybe that's the wrong thing to say. Perhaps if he had been portrayed in a different manner, he might have been received better by the audiences, certain audiences, not all. It depended. I guess the audiences. It depended on where he was playing. If we were playing, let's say, at a hall in Newark, New Jersey, or Carnegie Hall, the reception, of course, was different. But when you were playing for European audiences, or maybe some audience out in California, there was a very obvious difference to the way it was received, which, of course, just means that it wasn't received universally the same way, which tells you something about the popularity of the style. We were talking about that earlier, where maybe in the East it was more popular than it was in the West, or certain sections of the Midwest or the South, So, but it had varied receptions all over the country. But it didn't detract from the style itself, which was, of course, I think, a great style, without referring to the name Be-Bop. Oh, I said it again, I'm sorry. I worked with Billy Eckstine's big band, but never in a small band context. Now, he had a band at the then Cotton Club, which was on, or was it on, not 7th Avenue, the next street over, in Harlem, about 155th Street, I believe it was, around in that area. But it was the Cotton Club. Bill Eckstine was not only a fine singer, but a lot of people don't know, but he was a great valve trombone player. Oh, excellent. He played, you've heard Bobby Brookmeyer, excellent player, but his playing was on that level. Excellent. He could have been one of the greatest valve trombone players in the world, fact was, but nobody knew it, because they thought of him as being a fine singer, which he was. But very, very, very great performer. If I'd like to, I'd like to tell about an incident that happened at the Cotton Club. It has nothing to do with Billy singing, but it has something to do with what happened during one of the dances, one of the performances up at the Cotton Club. Yeah, you've heard of a trumpet player named Fats Navarro. Let's say they didn't call him Fats for nothing. He weighed about 300 pounds, And when the band was playing, The way the big band is set up, each section is on a different tier, maybe. So you have the rhythm section on the floor level, then you have the trombone section, reeds, then you have the trumpet players on the top level, which is top tier. So we're playing a blues called "Blowin' the Blues," or something like that. And Fats Navarro, Fats Navarro had a solo to play in this tune. So instead of stepping down gently, he jumped down and he fell through the floor. And he never stopped playing. Well, everybody was on the floor. Everything stopped for about 10 minutes. But he didn't stop playing. He just kept playing. The band kept playing. It's very strange. But anyway, he didn't get hurt. That's the main thing. But anyway, but Eckstein, as I said, played some great solos. I mean, it's too bad that he wasn't known as a valve trombone player, as a great trombonist, because he was. Didn't know him personally, but I had great respect for his work. He always treated the band with great respect. By the way, one of the players who's around today was in with that band, Frank West, the tenor saxophone player. And there were a couple of others, but Frank was the one that I do a lot of work with today. But have nothing but praise for his work. And the few times that I had a chance to talk with him, it was very pleasant, all business, and just a perfect band leader. Should have been better known as a player, though. Coleman Hawkins was a great soloist. He had worked with the Fletcher Henderson band. I met him for the first time with Jazz at the Philharmonic. And following that first tour, I worked with him at the place called the Spotlight Club on 52nd Street after we got back from that first JATP tour. But after that, I went to Paris, and I worked. There was a little street in Brussels, brother, I should say. There was a big hotel called the Metropole, right? It sits right. It filled up a block this way, a block that way, a block that way. So huge hotel. And one of the side streets leading down from the hotel was a little club. And I walked into this. I looked in the window and I saw this picture of Coleman Hawkins, and somebody had painted a mustache on his lips. Huge mustache. So he had been there, obviously. But anyway. He was a great player. His outstanding record, of course, was Body and Soul. And it set the tone for a lot of tenor saxophone players who not only played the solo as he played, but also played in the style. They adapted their style to his style, which was a very pleasing, true tenor saxophone style. He got a very true sound, as opposed to some tenor saxophone players who get a very light sound that sounds almost like an alto saxophone. Coleman Hawkins had a true, like Chude Berry, had this great saxophone sound, true tenor saxophone sound, and it was very pleasant. That's right. Had a lot to do, I think, with the success of the Body and Soul record. But he was very, very, very precise. What can I say about it? Well, I know when I worked with him at the Spotlight, he could play long solos. He might play a solo that would take, he could play maybe 5, 6, 7 courses, never get tired, And then by the time it was time sometime easily for me to play a solo, I would be so tired of accompanying, I couldn't think of anything to play, But he was a great soloist. Nice person, too. Nice individual. Lester Young. Lester, I have to say, was probably the most original individual I have ever met. I mean, everything that he did was completely original. I've never seen anybody or ever heard anybody play like him or dress like him or talk like him. The way he wore his clothes, he always wore a pork pie hat. When I think of his image, that's what I see the first thing. His style of playing was unique. And first, when I first saw him, he used to hold the tenor saxophone up in this position, the flute position, How he ever did that, I'll never know, because it's a lot heavier than a flute. And just the physical effort of holding it up like that must have been something, you know. It took a lot of effort, but that's where he played. Then later on, he played it down in the original position, the well-known position. But I could never understand why he did that. But his sound was different from anybody else's sound. His style was different. The way he talked was different from anybody else's talk. Everything. The way he walked was different. Once I saw him at a place called on the Broadway, called not the Three. It was right across the street. It was on 7th Broadway. And at the corner, let's say, where Broadway intersects with 7th Avenue, near there, a little club, downstairs club. And he was in there one night, and he walked in, he was playing a tune. At first he said, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to play a tune called A Slow Boat to China, fast." And he's talking about, that's the way he played the tune. But I mean, I had never heard anybody else do that. This man was a complete individualist. Completely different. Great style. In fact, he influenced any number of tenor saxophone players, somewhat the same way that Coleman Hawkins influenced a lot of tenor saxophone players. Maybe a lot of people just copied his style, note for note, the way he did. But a very strong influence on the way they played, because it was a viable style. I don't know, it must have been not easy to master, but certainly worth mastering. So they wanted to do that, out of respect for him, and of course out of respect for what he tried to do in the style that was being accepted by the public, So I think a lot of factors played in there. He had the kind of style that if there was a storm going on, he calmed the storm, and everything then went along smoothly. Somebody else could do that was Basie, Count Basie. I was on a record. I'm just digressing a little bit, but I was on a date. I was doing a date with Illinois Jacket, and Basie was supposed to be on the date, but he was doing something else. He had a recording date or something. Couldn't get there on another date. The dates overlapped, so he couldn't get there. So we were trying to do this tune called "Don't You Go Away Mad." It had another title to it, but we couldn't find the right tempo on it. And we must have spent 15 or 20 minutes trying to find the right, because every tune has a right tempo. Well, we couldn't find the tempo on this tune. So finally, Count Basie showed up, and he listened for it, and they said, "Well, try it this tempo." That was it. He found the right tempo, But he had that ability. Somebody else that could do that was Benny Goodman. They had this knack of finding the right tempo. That taught me that every tune has a correct tempo. But then again, there's this factor of the right tempo comes into play. Neil Hefti wrote a tune. It was ba da 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 do da do da. That. But I mean, originally the tempo is here. Basie slowed it down, da, 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 and it became a hit. You see, so the tempo is very important. There's always a correct tempo for every tune, if you can find it, if you're lucky enough to discover it. Dynamic is the word I have to use for him. Explosive, unpredictable sometimes. He had a solo, a great solo on "Flying Home" that I think sort of catapulted him into the public consciousness, and he played it for all it was worth. But he never let the public forget that that's what got him there. Anyway, that was a smart thing to do, and it always got great reactions from the audience, because that one solo exemplified his whole approach to music, his style. It was all there. When you heard that record, you heard Illinois Jacket. And it was a very explosive, infectious kind of style. So it was great. It was great to play him. He had all this vigor and this vitality and energy that he put into it. That was his style. That was Illinois. I did one recording date with her, and I think it was the last recording date that she did before she passed. It was with a fairly large studio orchestra, maybe 17, 18 pieces. And she was very ill at the time. She had problems with her legs, her feet, And, of course, I don't know what caused all the problems, that she was in physical decline. But it didn't affect the way she sang. Her voice was steady. She had the same feel, you know, even though she was physically suffering, you knew that. But it didn't affect her style. She always had that same style, same phrasing. One of the best things that I ever heard her do was with Paul Whiteman's orchestra. She did Traveling Light with that orchestra. To me, that was the Billie Holiday that everybody should remember. Fantastic. It was the best example of her phrasing, sort of like a little, almost like a very plaintive approach to singing. She took her time in a very light, unpretentious voice. She projected well, because when she started to sing, you listened for that. You expected to hear that, and that's what you got, you know. She was no coloratura soprano. I mean, you know, she was an opera singer, but she got her point across musically. You know, it was very, very interesting and pleasant to hear. It's great. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to work with her on a long-term basis, but yeah, she phrased, let's say, quite differently, let's say from Ella Fitzgerald, or Dinah Washington, people like that. But again, she was a great stylist, and all these other people. Dinah was a great stylist. Ella was a great stylist. And I think that's the whole thing. I think that's what you listen for, because you certainly wouldn't want to hear everybody that sounded exactly the same. So it's like comparing. You can't compare apples and oranges, you know, because they're different things. They're both fruit, but one is completely different from the other. Well, singers are the same way. There were things that you love about Ella. There were things that you love about Billie Holiday. They both had their individual styles, and they came across beautifully, you know. Well, Miles Davis, when I was working with Coleman Hawkins at the Spotlight, Miles was in the group. We had Max Roach on drums, Curly Russell playing bass, and Miles was playing trumpet, and Coleman Hawkins was playing tenor, and I was trying to play the piano. You know, it was interesting. But Miles was a fine trumpet player even then, back in those days. Later, he became even better known. What I didn't know at that time was that he was also a great composer. You know, he wrote this tune, Move, that became almost like a jazz standard. He's written some other tunes, like some blues tunes, and a lot of stuff. But he became much better known after that period, because he became a leader on his own. And when he became a leader, I guess he had a lot more musical leeway to do what he wanted, the things he wanted to do. And he became better known to the general public, but he was a fine trumpet player back in those days. Right? Must have been around, 1948, 1947. Great player. Max Roach, of course, was the drummer who was, let's say, better known for working with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie prior to that time. He was the first drummer that I heard who played that style. That style meaning Be-Bop, the term I'm not that pleased with anyway, but he was most associated with that style, played with that band. Later on, other drummers played with him, but Max was the drummer I heard when I first heard that style. He was a great soloist. You know, his solos were all pattern solos. He would start a pattern, and then he would repeat the pattern in a different start a different pattern, and his solos were all a succession of patterns, rhythmic patterns. So they were all interesting from that standpoint. You know, you never seemed to run out of patterns, you know. But he was great for that kind of music. When I first heard Monk, I was most impressed by his voicings. I've never heard anybody who voiced chords before or since the way Monk did. It's hard to describe. I mean, he used chords that are not normally used. Now, Bud Powell was, of course, a great exponent of the Be-Bop style of playing, and he was well known for that. But also, what people don't know is that Bud could also play solo piano beautifully. He could use both hands, and when he played, his playing was somewhat reminiscent of, you might say, Teddy Wilson, or between Art Tatum and Teddy Wilson. He played beautiful solo piano, but he never, for some reason, he didn't like to do it, or he didn't record as much solo as he should have. he would have been well known as a soloist, but he decided not to do it. But his playing with the group, the Be-Bop Star group, was outstanding, and that's how I first heard him. He was working with the Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker group. That was a fantastic group, you know. But it just, you know, and it proves one point. When you have a group like that can never really be duplicated. I've never heard a group before or since that group. The same thing can be said about the Benny Goodman Trio with Teddy Wilson, Gene Krupa, and Benny, or the Soft Winds, you know, with Johnny Frigo and Herb Ellis and that group, you know, and the piano player. But groups are unique in that sense. If it's a good group, there's no repetition of that group. It just never happens for one reason or another, you know. But it's too bad because I would like to hear some of those groups again. But you know, you can hear them, but only on recordings today, you know. I did a recording date with John Coltrane. Of course, Elvin was on the date as well. But it was just that one date that I did. And I don't know how I got called on the date, but for some reason the regular pianist wasn't there. But it was interesting, you know, but I had heard a lot about John Coltrane. When I first met John, it was in Philadelphia. He was a very good friend of the Heath brothers, you know, and I worked a couple of dates over there. And after the dates, we used to go to one of the Horn and Hardart restaurants, you know, the Automat restaurant. Remember those? You're too young to know about that. But there was a chain of restaurants called Horn and Hardart. They were automat. When you wanted something, you go to the machine and put a quarter in, a nickel or a dime, whatever, and you get the food to come out automatically. Well, anyway, we used to hang out after the gigs at this restaurant, and that's where I first met John Coltrane. But of course, I didn't hear him in a playing situation at that time. Later on, he became a leader, and then, you know, the rest is history. He became a great leader. His playing, a lot of musicians didn't accept his playing at the time. It was the kind of, I guess he had the style that sort of had to grow. It had to grow on you, you know. Elvin stayed with him. My brother Elvin stayed with him for several years, and I think it was a good vehicle for Elvin, you know, because it gave Elvin a chance to play the way that he likes to play and be better heard and recognized. So I think it was a great vehicle for him, and I think he really thoroughly enjoyed himself playing because it gave him all the freedom that he wanted, you know. And yet he could meld with the group to get a group sound, you know, as we were discussing earlier. So I think it was a good film all around. His playing was out of the box, so to speak. I mean, he believed in pushing out a little further, you know, enlarging the field, you know, and maybe doing something that some of the other players didn't want to do or couldn't think of doing or for one reason or another didn't do. So his playing took on an aspect of individuality, originality that other players could not do or didn't want to do. In other words, he was a nonconformist musically, and I think that's the legacy that he leaves. He had a lot of converts, people that play not especially, they don't emulate him particularly, but in that they play in that idiom. It gives them a chance to express their feelings of wanting to do something different without being too different. See, being different for the sake of being different is not a good enough excuse to do it, you know. I mean, if you want to be different, you can take a few pans of different sizes and drop them on the floor. You can get a sound. But that's not necessarily a musical sound, you know. The trick is to do something musically that's relevant enough, although it may not be completely relevant to the harmony, at least maybe it establishes a new avenue of approach to something, you know, musical approach. But the players who do that and do it well, they leave something behind except just a series of notes strung together. A series of notes strung together are only meaningful if they elaborate or delineate a position, a musical position, or a musical thought. If they don't, it's just a series of notes, like we were talking about complex playing. Complex playing is only desirable or valid if it proves a point. But the point not being the complexity itself, because anybody can do that, you know. I mean, but to make it relevant to the music is another thing altogether. The idea of being able to, or having the instinct or desire to relate to what's going on around you. I think that may be the defining answer to that, because unless you do that, you can't really be creative unless you can relate to something that you're trying to create from, because nothing starts in a vacuum. You start out with, let's say, a set of harmonic changes. Now, if you want to be creative, you don't want to change the harmonic structure, but you want to create based on those the harmonic structure. You see, so I think that's one reason it keeps you going, because you're always trying to create something out of the existing structure. It's like building a house. You have to start with a foundation. Out of the foundation, you can do any number of different varieties of a house. You can build the endless varieties of styles you can use based on a basic foundation. Same thing is true, I think, with a musical composition or a set of changes. You started with a set of changes, you build harmonically, and you build lines on that foundation, on that harmonic structure, also described as a foundation. Without the foundation, you have nothing to build on. So I think it's all important, you know. If you live a life based on the Ten Commandments, that's your foundation. Then you can lead a productive life that doesn't harm anybody, that does good, that you maintain your own health, and you increase your possibility of creative change, whatever you want to do. But it all starts with those basic commandments, which, if you follow through religiously, and I'm not trying to be overly religious, but I'm saying religious in the sense that you stick to it. You have to be a better person. You have to become a better person, a more productive person, a more person who's, let's say, more loving, more giving, a more kind person, a person who can relate to their fellow human beings in a way that exemplifies, let's say, the golden rule: do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And I think that's a good rule to live by. And that's part of the basic harmonic change that it refers to life. You can say life is a series of harmonic changes, you know, basic changes, and then various other changes based on those basic changes. I believe in God. I've been a Christian since I was 12 years old. I was baptized at the age of 12, and I've tried to live my life as a Christian. And I think that's a good way to live. The future of music depends on the young people involved with it today, because I think music will progress as long as we have, whether you're talking about jazz or whether you're talking about even the classics, it will progress as long as there are people to carry on the traditions. If I never get there, at least I will have tried. You know, that's what every young person should do. I think that that accounts for all the progress that's been made up to date since jazz first gained the prominence that it has, or the acceptance that it has gained, even from the very beginnings. If nobody had ever tried to do anything better, we'd still be at the same point that we were 150, 200 years ago. So it has to be based on the effort and energy that people put into going forward, always thinking ahead. Not necessarily out of the box, so to speak, to use a common term today, but at least in a fashion where you constantly, I guess the key word here is to always constantly think of improving what you did before, improving on what you did before, realizing that there's always another step that you can go. And the more steps you take forward, the more steps there are to take. So that, in a sense, that perpetuates the music that's being created. It perpetuates the form because it's going to always be there. There'll be always somebody who is trying to do it better. And that's the key.